June 4, 1942. 60 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the Pacific Ocean stretched empty and blue beneath a cloudless morning sky. 20,000 feet above that deceptive calm, Lieutenant Junior Grade Norman Dusty Clyce leaned forward in his cockpit, squinting through the perforated aluminum fuselage of his SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Sweat pooled beneath his leather flight helmet. His hands gripped the control stick with the particular tension of a man searching for something that might already have found him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Below, nothing. Just water catching light like hammered steel. Behind him, radio man gunner John Snowden sat silent in the rear seat, scanning the horizon through twin .30 caliber machine guns that felt increasingly useless against an enemy he couldn't see. They'd been airborne for nearly 3 hours. Fuel gauges dipped toward the red. Wade McCluskey, their air group commander, had gambled everything on a hunch, vectoring northwest when logic said return to Enterprise. Now 32 dive bombers circled empty ocean, burning fuel they couldn't spare, searching for 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that intelligence promised were here. Somewhere, maybe. Then Clyce saw it. A single white wake cutting diagonally across the blue, sharp and purposeful. The destroyer Arashi, running full speed, leaving a trail like chalk on slate. McCluskey saw it too. His voice crackled through the radio, calm as Sunday morning. Follow that wake. No explanation, no debate. Just the kind of battlefield intuition that either saves fleets or drowns them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Dauntlesses banked northwest, following the destroyer's trajectory, like bloodhounds following scent. And then the ocean changed. Ships appeared, dozens of them, arranged in defensive formation around 4 massive aircraft carriers, their flight decks crawling with activity. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the 1st Carrier Striking Force, the same elite unit that had shattered Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. They were turning into the wind, preparing to launch. Clyce felt his stomach tighten, not from fear, exactly, from recognition. He was looking at the moment every tactical manual said couldn't happen. The Japanese carriers were caught mid-operation, planes being fueled, armed with torpedoes and bombs meant for an American fleet they believed was still steaming from Pearl Harbor. Fuel hoses snaked across flight decks. Ordnance crews worked in organized chaos, swapping bomb loads based on conflicting orders. A second strike on Midway. No, an anti-ship loadout. No, back to island bombardment. Nagumo's staff had been changing their minds all morning, and the physical evidence of that indecision lay scattered across 4 carrier decks in neat rows of explosive vulnerability. McCluskey's voice came through again. Scouting 6, take Kaga. Bombing 6, take Akagi. Execute, execute, execute. The dive bombers split into 2 elements, climbing to attack altitude. Clyce checked his bomb sight, a simple optical device that reduced naval warfare to geometry and timing. The Dauntless could dive at 80 degrees, nearly vertical, controlled by perforated dive brakes that howled like demons when deployed. Release altitude, 2,500 feet. Airspeed at release, 240 knots. Pull out at 9 Gs, enough force to grey your vision and flood your mouth with the copper taste of blood pressure spiking. Miss, and you'd put a 500-pound bomb into empty ocean while Japanese Zeros tore you apart during the climb out. Hit, and you'd change history. At 10:22 in the morning, Midway time, Clyce rolled his, Dauntless into its dive. The world tilted 90 degrees. The ocean rushed upward. Kaga's flight deck filled his windscreen, growing from postage stamp to football field in seconds that felt like hours. His altimeter unwound like a broken clock. 18,000 feet. 15,000. 12. The perforated dive brakes screamed their mechanical protest, holding the Dauntless to a speed that kept the dive controllable instead of terminal. Around him, other SBDs plummeted through the same killing geometry, 32 bombers converging on 2 carriers from the same impossible angle. Below, Japanese lookouts finally saw what radar would have shown them minutes earlier if they'd had it. Black dots appearing high above, growing larger, resolving into the distinctive bent-wing silhouettes of American dive bombers. Alarm bells rang across the Kido Butai. Gun crews swiveled their 25mm anti-aircraft cannons skyward, opening fire with tracers that rose like slow-moving basketballs, deceptively gentle until you understood they were moving at the speed that punched through aluminum like paper. Kleiss ignored them. He'd learned to ignore everything except the bombsight reticle and the target growing in his windscreen. Kaga's forward deck bore a large red circle, the rising sun insignia painted proud for identification. Kleiss used it as his aim point. Through his simple optical sight, he watched that red circle steady as his dive angle held. The mathematics of ballistics reduced war to physics. Velocity, angle, wind drift, target movement, all calculated in the seconds before release. His thumb moved to the bomb release button. Not yet. Hold it. Let the convergence zone tighten. 1,500 feet. The deck resolved into individual details. Parked aircraft, their wings folded, men running. Some pointing upward, some diving for cover, some frozen in that particular paralysis that overtakes humans when death arrives from directions they can't fight. 1,200 feet. Kleiss's training, his nerve, and every tactical brief he'd absorbed compressed into a single action. His thumb pressed the release. 3 bombs dropped, 1 500-pounder from the fuselage centerline, 2 smaller incendiaries from wing mounts. They fell for a second that felt like eternity, following arcs calculated by gravity and velocity. Then they hit. The 500-pound bomb struck Kaga's flight deck exactly where Kleiss had aimed, right at the edge of that red rising sun. It penetrated through 4 decks before detonating in the forward hangar bay, precisely where Type 97 torpedo bombers sat, fueled and armed with long-lance torpedoes, the kind loaded with 800 pounds of high explosive designed to crack battleship hulls. The secondary explosion was biblical. Kaga's entire forward section erupted in flame and fragmented steel. The fuel from 24 aircraft ignited simultaneously. Torpedoes cooked off in chain reaction. The ship's structure, designed to contain battle damage, couldn't contain physics. Fire spread faster than damage control crews could respond, feeding on aviation gasoline that vaporized into explosive vapor before igniting in pressure waves that rippled through the hangar spaces like trapped thunder. Kleiss yanked his stick back, pulling out of the dive with 9 Gs that crushed him into his seat, turned his vision grey at the edges, made his arms feel like they weighed 100 pounds each. The ocean filled his windscreen, closer than training said was safe, then dropped away as the Dauntless clawed back to altitude on momentum and a right cyclone engine screaming at full military power. He kicked rudder, banking to look back at his target. Kaga was dying, not slowly, not gradually. The carrier was undergoing what would later be described as a series of explosions that utterly eviscerated the ship. Flames jetted from the hangar bay openings. The forward flight deck buckled. Men jumped from the sides, choosing the ocean over incineration, falling like dark raindrops into water that would kill them just as surely, but slower. A 0 dropped on Kleiss's tail. Snowden's 30 calibers opened up, the staccato bark audible even over the engine roar. 2 seconds of fire. The 0 tumbled sideways, trailing smoke, its pilot dead or dying. No time to confirm. Kleiss dove for the deck, flying at wave-top height through a forest of ship masts, changing altitude and heading every second to make himself an impossible target for anti-aircraft gunners tracking manually. Tracers arced overhead. Some passed so close he could see them through his side window, curved lines of light representing metal moving fast enough to turn aluminum into confetti. He looked back one more time. 3 carriers were burning. Kaga from his squadron's attack. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, from Bombing 6's strike. Soryu from Yorktown's dive bombers, who'd arrived simultaneously by sheer coincidence that tactical doctrine called impossible. 3 fleet carriers, the core of Japan's offensive power in the Pacific, had been reduced to flaming wreckage in 6 minutes. Not 6 hours, not 6 days. 6 minutes, the time it takes to soft-boil an egg. Inside Akagi's bridge, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same man who'd led the Pearl Harbor attack, stood watching his carrier die from the inside. He'd seen the dive bombers too late, black specks against blue sky that suddenly weren't specks anymore, but full-sized aircraft plunging downward at angles that made no tactical sense. One bomb, maybe two. That's all it took. A single 1,000-pound bomb struck the edge of the midship elevator, penetrated to the hangar deck, detonated among aircraft that were fueled, armed, and waiting to launch. The explosion that followed wasn't just destructive, it was transformative. It turned a warship into a furnace. Fuchida felt the deck heave beneath his feet. The bridge structure shuddered. Smoke poured through. Ventilation shafts designed to move air, not toxic gas. Men around him staggered, some wounded by flying steel, others simply overwhelmed by the sensory assault of their flagship disintegrating in real time. Through the smoke, he saw Nagumo standing motionless, face blank, unable to process what his experience said was impossible. You didn't lose fleet carriers to single bomb hits. Carriers were designed to absorb punishment. But design couldn't account for timing. The Americans had caught them at the precise moment when doctrine said they were invulnerable, and reality proved they were catastrophically exposed. Every bomb and torpedo that was supposed to be secured in magazines below the waterline sat on deck, stacked beside aircraft that were themselves miniature explosives on wings. Fuel hoses connected planes to aviation gas tanks. Ordnance crews had been too rushed to stow removed weapons properly. The deck wasn't a military installation anymore. It was an ammunition dump waiting for ignition, and the Americans had provided the spark. Akagi's damage control teams fought fires they couldn't control. Aviation gasoline burns hot enough to melt steel. It vaporizes into explosive atmosphere faster than water can suppress it. Below decks, induced explosions rippled through compartments in sequence as fires found new fuel sources. Torpedoes that should have been killing American ships instead killed the Japanese carrier they were stored on. Bombs meant for Midway detonated against Akagi's interior bulkheads, spreading destruction inward instead of outward, turning defensive armor into a crematorium that trapped the fire rather than containing it. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagara at 11:15. The decision came 90 minutes too late, made by a man whose mind had stopped processing tactical reality somewhere around the moment he watched 3 of his 4 carriers catch fire simultaneously. He'd built a career on surface warfare, torpedo attacks, and gun battles decided by battleship salvos. He understood naval aviation in theory, but not practice. And now practice had just demonstrated that the age of the battleship was over. The age of the carrier had arrived, and he'd lost 3 of them before lunch. On Kaga, 811 men would die. On Soryu, 718. On Akagi, the final toll would reach 267 before the ship was scuttled by Japanese destroyers the next morning to prevent capture. Those numbers represented more than casualties. They represented a generation of trained naval aviators, mechanics, flight deck crews, and commanders who'd spent years perfecting carrier operations. Men who'd executed the Pearl Harbor strike with precision. Men who'd ranged across the Pacific with impunity for 6 months. Men who couldn't be replaced, not quickly, not at scale, not by an empire whose industrial capacity was already stretched thin by wars in China, Southeast Asia, and now the Central Pacific. Japan's pilot training program took years to produce a single carrier-qualified aviator. The Americans, with their vastly superior industrial base and training infrastructure, could replace losses in months. That arithmetic alone doomed the Japanese war effort. But Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto didn't know that yet, standing on Yamato's bridge 300 miles to the west, receiving fragmentary reports that made no tactical sense. 3 carriers destroyed in 6 minutes? Impossible. Exaggeration. Battle fog amplifies setbacks into catastrophe. He waited for clarification that would never come because the reports weren't exaggerated. They were understated. The disaster was worse than the initial messages suggested, and it was about to get worse still. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had escaped the initial strike by sheer ice. Geography. She'd been positioned 20 miles from the main formation, an operational separation that saved her from the dive bombers' attention. Now she represented Japan's only remaining offensive capability. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu's battle group, ordered an immediate counterstrike. Every available aircraft, every pilot. Launch them at the American carriers before the Americans could reorganize for another attack. It was sound doctrine, aggressive, bold, the kind of tactical decision that wins battles when executed properly. But Yamaguchi was launching with a fraction of his normal strength. Hiryu's air group had been depleted by morning operations. Now he could muster 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, enough to damage maybe one American carrier if he was lucky. Not enough to change the battle's trajectory. Those planes found Yorktown at noon, attacking through a combat air patrol that shot down most of them. 3 bombs hit. Yorktown's damage control teams worked miracles, containing fires, restoring power, patching the flight deck with steel plates welded directly over bomb craters. Within hours, she was recovering aircraft again. The Americans had learned damage control from the British, who'd been absorbing punishment from German bombs for years. Japanese doctrine emphasized offense over defense. It showed. Back on Enterprise, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher received orders to lead the afternoon strike. 24 dive bombers, target. Hiryu, last known position, carrier operating independently northeast of the burning wreckage that used to be Japan's first carrier striking force. Kleiss, who'd landed 2 hours earlier with fuel gauges reading empty, grabbed a sandwich, drank black coffee that tasted like burned metal, and caught 15 minutes of sleep sitting upright in the ready room. Then he climbed back into his Dauntless, John Snowden sliding into the rear seat without comment. Both men understanding that wars aren't decided by single missions. You keep flying until the enemy stops moving or you run out of planes. They found Hiryu at 1700 hours. She was conducting evasive maneuvers, turning hard, trying to avoid becoming a stationary target. It didn't matter. Kleiss had already put a bomb onto a stationary carrier that morning. A turning carrier just meant adjusting his calculations. He watched the 3 aircraft ahead of him in the dive sequence. Lieutenant Richard Jacquard, the rookie, scored the first hit. His 500-pounder punched through Hiryu's forward elevator, flinging the massive steel slab upward against the bridge structure like a child's toy. Kleiss came fourth in the dive sequence. He'd already hit Kaga that morning. Now he had to hit a moving target that was also executing a sharp turn. The mathematics got complicated. Dive angle, wind drift, target speed, rate of turn, all factored in real time by a man who'd been awake for 14 hours and flying for 6 of them. His training compressed into muscle memory. The bomb sight reticle steadied on Hiryu's bow. Release altitude 2,200 feet. He pressed the button. The bomb dropped. Fell. Hit. Detonated in the forward section of the ship, adding another puncture to the hull, another fire to the damage control team's impossible workload. 4 more bombs followed from the aircraft behind him. Hiryu didn't sink immediately. She burned through the night, her crew fighting fires with diminishing resources until the order to abandon ship came at dawn. Japanese destroyers would scuttle her with torpedoes, sending her to the bottom of the Pacific alongside her 3 sister ships, 4 fleet carriers, all sunk. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific erased in a single day. Kleiss pulled away from the burning Hiryu, his Dauntless climbing through smoke that smelled like oil and cordite and something else he didn't want to identify. Behind him, Snowden reported 0 fighters climbing to intercept, but they were too few and too late. The American dive bombers scattered, each pilot finding his own escape vector through a sky that had belonged to Japan that morning, and now belonged to no one. The fuel gauges read critical. Enterprise was 150 miles away. The sun sat low on the horizon, turning the Pacific into hammered copper. Navigation by dead reckoning, hope that the WWII homing beacon would guide them back before engines coughed dry. They made it, barely. Kleiss touched down on Enterprise's deck with fumes in his tanks, caught the number 3 wire, and felt the tailhook drag his aircraft to a stop with a jolt that rattled his teeth. Deck crews swarmed immediately, chocking wheels, folding wings, pushing the Dauntless toward the forward elevator to clear the landing area for aircraft behind him. He climbed out on legs that trembled from adrenaline depletion and sustained G-forces. Snowden emerged from the rear cockpit, face streaked with powder residue from firing his guns, eyes hollow with exhaustion that went beyond physical. They'd been in combat for 9 hours, 2 missions, 2 carriers hit, and somehow they were still alive when 43 other aircrews weren't. The ready room felt like a morgue, empty seats where friends had sat that morning, plotting boards marked with aircraft that hadn't returned. Torpedo Squadron 8 wiped out completely. 15 aircraft, 30 men, gone. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor, floating in the Pacific for 30 hours while the battle raged around him, watching from water level as Japanese ships burned and American planes dove, and men died in ways the movies would never show accurately. The torpedo bombers had attacked first, coming in low and slow with Mark 13 torpedoes that ran poorly when they ran at all. Japanese Zeros had slaughtered them, not defeated, slaughtered. 39 out of 41 torpedo bombers shot down, the crews killed before they could release their weapons or killed immediately after when Zeros strafed them in the water. No parachutes deployed because parachutes don't work at 200 feet altitude. No life rafts launched because there wasn't time. Just aircraft hitting the ocean and disintegrating and men disappearing beneath waves that kept no record of their sacrifice. But that slaughter had been tactical necessity disguised as waste. The torpedo bombers drew Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top level, pulling Zeros away from altitude where they should have been positioned to intercept dive bombers. When Kleiss and McCluskey arrived at 20,000 feet, the sky above the carriers was empty. No opposition, no fighters, just clear air and perfect attack geometry, and 6 minutes where American dive bombers owned the battle space because torpedo crews had died buying them that window. Lieutenant James Porter, who'd flown strafers over the Bismarck Sea, would have understood the mathematics. Sometimes victory requires someone to absorb the enemy's attention while the killing blow comes from an unexpected angle. The torpedo squadrons were the distraction. The dive bombers were the execution. Both were necessary. One was survivable. The asymmetry of that equation haunted the ready rooms for months afterward. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from Enterprise, studied the damage reports with the clinical precision of a man who'd spent 30 years learning naval warfare. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. 1 American carrier, Yorktown, heavily damaged but afloat. The tactical mathematics favored continuing the engagement, pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet, pressing the advantage. But Spruance understood something that separated competent commanders from great ones. He understood when to stop fighting. Yamamoto's main battle fleet, centered on the super battleship Yamato with her 18-inch guns, still lurked somewhere to the west. In a night surface engagement, Japanese battleships would tear American carriers apart. Spruance's carriers were his only capital ships. Lose them, and the victory at Midway became meaningless. Japan would retain naval superiority, could invade Midway at leisure, could threaten Hawaii directly. The war in the Pacific would continue on Japan's terms, but preserve the carriers, even at the cost of letting damaged Japanese ships escape, and the strategic balance shifted permanently. Spruance ordered the fleet to withdraw east at sunset. Yamamoto, receiving reports of the carrier losses, understood what it meant. Without carrier-based air cover, his battleships were just expensive targets for land-based bombers. The Midway operation was over. He ordered the fleet to withdraw west. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval forces were retreating before they'd achieved their objectives. The tide in the Pacific hadn't turned. The tide had reversed entirely. On June 5th, Enterprise and Hornets dive bombers ranged west, hunting crippled Japanese ships. They found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma damaged from a collision during the night withdrawal. Kleiss made his third attack of the battle, putting another 500-pound bomb onto Mikuma near her smokestacks. The cruiser would sink that evening, adding one more ship to the tally that would rewrite every Pacific War assessment back in Washington and Tokyo. In 3 days of fighting, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 3,000 men including many of their best pilots, and something less tangible but more devastating, the strategic initiative in the Pacific. The battle that was supposed to draw out the American fleet for destruction had instead become Japan's greatest naval defeat since the 19th century. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American victory at Midway didn't feel like victory to the men who'd flown the missions. Victory was supposed to be clean, decisive. This was decisive, certainly, but it was anything but clean. 147 American aircraft destroyed, 307 Americans killed. Yorktown would survive 2 more days before a Japanese submarine put torpedoes into her hull and sent her to the bottom on June 7th, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The symmetry felt deliberate, though history doesn't care about symbolism. In Tokyo's underground command center, the shock rippled through layers of military hierarchy with the force of a physical blow. Admiral Yamamoto received the initial reports on June 4th, fragmentary messages that spoke of carrier damage, operational setbacks, tactical complications. By June 5th, the truth had clarified into undeniable catastrophe. The first carrier striking force, the elite unit that had ranged across the Pacific with impunity, had been destroyed in a single morning by a numerically inferior American force. The question that haunted Japanese naval staff wasn't how it happened. The after-action reports made that clear enough. Poor reconnaissance, divided attention between island bombardment and fleet defense, bad timing that caught carriers with armed aircraft on deck, a series of small tactical errors that compounded into strategic disaster. The question was what it meant. Could Japan replace 4 fleet carriers eventually? Could they replace the trained air crews? That was harder. Could they regain offensive momentum against an American industrial base that was just beginning to mobilize for total war? That question had no good answer. Admiral Nagumo survived the battle physically, but not professionally. He'd lost 3 carriers under his command in 6 minutes, then lost the 4th carrier in his formation 6 hours later. Command of carrier operations would pass to others. He'd be reassigned to secondary theaters, eventually ending up commanding land-based naval and forces in the Marianas, where he'd commit suicide in 1944 rather than face capture. His legacy would be forever linked to 2 battles, the stunning success at Pearl Harbor and the catastrophic failure at Midway. History would remember the second more than the first. The Japanese propaganda machine couldn't hide losses this severe, not entirely, though they tried. Newspapers reported a great victory at Midway, claiming 2 American carriers sunk for minimal Japanese losses. But sailors came home with stories that contradicted the official narrative. Families of the 3,000 dead received notification that their sons and husbands and fathers had been killed in action, and those notifications told a truth that propaganda couldn't erase. The Kido Butai, which had seemed invincible 6 months earlier, had been destroyed by an enemy Japan's military leadership had consistently underestimated. The Americans had done something Japan's pre-war planning assumed was impossible. They'd absorbed the Pearl Harbor strike, rebuilt their fleet in 6 months, broken Japanese naval codes, positioned their carriers for an ambush, and executed a near-perfect tactical strike at the exact moment when the Japanese were most vulnerable. That required industrial capacity, intelligence gathering, cryptanalysis, tactical flexibility, and combat training across multiple dimensions. It required a military system that could learn, adapt, and execute at the highest levels. Japan's leadership had assumed America lacked the will for such performance. They'd confused comfort with weakness, democracy with inefficiency, and isolation with incompetence. Those assumptions died at Midway, along with 3,000 Japanese sailors. The Americans had demonstrated something more terrifying than military might. They'd demonstrated systematic competence, the ability to outproduce, outthink, and outfight an opponent despite starting from a position of strategic disadvantage. Wars aren't decided by opening attacks. They're decided by who can sustain operations, replace losses, and maintain pressure over years of grinding attrition. Japan had won the first 6 months. America would win the next 42. Captain Norman Kleiss understood none of this larger strategic picture on June 7th, when Enterprise docked at Pearl Harbor. He understood that he'd survived 3 combat missions in 4 days when most of his squadron hadn't. He understood that his bombing accuracy, 3 direct hits on 3 different ships, represented statistical anomaly masquerading as skill. Mostly, he understood that the men who died, the torpedo crews and the dive bomber pilots who'd been shot down, and the sailors on the carriers he'd bombed, they'd all been doing the same thing he was doing, following orders, executing training, trying to survive. The only difference between him and them was trajectory, altitude, and timing. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross in November 1942. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and exceptional flying skill. Kleiss accepted the medal because refusing it would dishonor the men who died earning victories he'd survived, but privately, he rejected the language. Heroism implied choice. He'd been following tactical doctrine. Skill implied superiority. He'd been executing training that any competent pilot could duplicate. The real heroes were the torpedo bomber crews, who'd flown into certain death to create the tactical conditions his survival required. They didn't get Navy crosses because they didn't survive to receive them. The Navy rotated him stateside after Midway, not as punishment but as policy. Unlike Germany and Japan, which kept their experienced pilots in combat until they died, America brought them home to train new aviators. It was the difference between a system that consumed expertise and one that multiplied it. Kleiss spent the rest of the war teaching dive-bombing techniques to pilots who'd fly in battles he'd never see. The Coral Sea, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, each battle larger than Midway, each requiring thousands of trained pilots, each possible only because America had the industrial and training capacity to replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. In Las Vegas on July 3, 1942, he married Eunice Marie Jean Mauchon, his longtime girlfriend who'd waited through Pearl Harbor and the Marshalls and Midway without knowing if he'd survive any of them. They'd stay married for 64 years until her death in 2006. When asked what his secret was, Kleiss would say she was 3 times smarter than him and he'd been smart enough to recognize it. That understated humility characterized his post-war life. He'd been part of the most important naval battle in the Pacific War, had personally sunk more enemy tonnage than most squadrons, and spent the next 70 years insisting he wasn't a hero. The book came late. Kleiss was 99 years old when he finally agreed to write his memoir, Never Call Me a Hero, working with naval historians Timothy and Laura Orr, who understood that first-hand accounts of Midway were disappearing as the generation who'd fought it aged into mortality. Kleiss wanted the record corrected. Not about tactics or battle timelines, those were well documented. About the men, the torpedo crews especially. Their sacrifice had been tactically necessary and strategically decisive, but it had also been unrecorded in the public narrative that focused on dive bombers and dramatic victories. He died in April 2016 at age 100, the last surviving dive bomber pilot from the Battle of Midway. His obituaries would note the Navy Cross, the 3 direct hits, the extraordinary accuracy. They wouldn't mention what he'd told the Orrs while writing his memoir, that every night for 70 years he'd see the faces of the men who didn't come back. Not Japanese sailors on burning carriers, American pilots in TBD Devastators who'd bought his survival with their deaths. That was the cost the after-action reports never calculated, the psychological weight of surviving when friends didn't, of success measured in enemy casualties that were also just men following orders, men with families who'd receive telegrams and fold flags and wonder what it all meant. For the Japanese carriers' crews, there'd been no warning. One moment, they were preparing to launch a strike against American carriers they believed were hours away. The next moment, black shapes appeared high above, and bombs were falling and their ships were erupting in flames they couldn't control. Some jumped overboard. Some were trapped below decks. Some fought fires until the fires won. 811 men on Kaga, 718 on Soryu, 267 on Akagi, 116 on Hiryu. Over 1,900 sailors total, plus the pilots and aircrew who died in combat or went down with their ships. Their names weren't recorded in American battle histories. They were enemy casualties, statistics in after-action reports, proof that the tactical doctrine worked. But they'd been doing the same jobs Kleiss and Snowden were doing, maintaining aircraft, loading ordnance, following orders, believing their cause was just. The only difference was the bombs fell on them instead of near them. Timing. Altitude. The chaotic mathematics of battle that reduces moral certainty to survival probability. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, understood what Midway meant before most of his staff did. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a strategic inflection point. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific had been destroyed. Their plan to isolate Hawaii and force a negotiated peace was over. American forces could now go on the offensive, island hopping across the Pacific, using carriers to project power and marines to seize islands and engineers to build airfields closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. Guadalcanal would come in August. The Solomons Campaign, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, each operation possible only because Midway had broken Japan's carrier fleet and shifted the naval balance permanently. American industrial production would do the rest. By 1943, new Essex-class carriers were joining the fleet at rates Japan couldn't match. By 1944, American carrier groups ranged across the Pacific with impunity, while Japan's remaining carriers sat in port, unable to operate effectively because they lacked trained pilots to fly from them. The war would continue for 3 more years. 50,000 more Americans would die in the Pacific. Millions of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilians would die. But the outcome was determined at Midway on June 4, 1942, in 6 minutes of dive bombing that destroyed Japan's ability to control the Central Pacific. Everything that followed was execution of a strategic reality that 6 minutes had established. For the dive bomber pilots, the battle condensed into moments of absolute focus, surrounded by hours of fear and boredom and exhaustion. Kleiss would remember the dive more than the result. The sensation of negative gravity as the Dauntless rolled inverted and pulled through into the 70-degree dive angle, the way the ocean rushed upward while the altimeter unwound, the perforated dive brakes screaming, the red circle on Kaga's deck growing larger, the thumb pressing the release button, the bomb falling away, the pull-out crushing him into his seat, the climb away through tracers and smoke, and then the looking back, seeing what he'd done, understanding that war was just physics applied to men who bled. Snowden would remember the 0 that came after them, 2 seconds of firing, the satisfying feeling of hits connecting, the 0 tumbling away trailing smoke, the knowledge that he'd just killed a man, probably a young man, probably someone with a family, someone who'd trained for years to fly that aircraft and died in seconds because combat doesn't care about training or family or youth. It just cares about angles and velocity and who sees whom first. These were the memories that didn't make it into tactical manuals or victory narratives or propaganda films. The intimate violence of aerial combat, the way death came from 20,000 feet at 240 knots and looked like black shapes against blue sky, until suddenly it didn't look like anything because you were vaporized before consciousness could register the event. The democracy of high explosives that didn't distinguish between admirals and deck crew, between experienced pilots and rookies, between causes that history would judge justified and causes it would judge criminal. The Battle of Midway established that the Pacific War would be decided by industrial capacity married to tactical competence. Japan had tactical competence but lacked industrial depth. America had both. The equation was simple, even if the execution would prove bloody. American factories could produce carriers faster than Japanese torpedoes could sink them. American training schools could produce pilots faster than Japanese bullets could kill them. American cryptanalysts could break Japanese codes faster than Japanese security could change them. These weren't guarantees of victory. They were probability shifts that accumulated over time, turning tactical defeats into strategic inevitability. For Kleiss, the knowledge came slowly. In 1942, teaching dive bombing to new pilots, he understood they were learning techniques that might keep them alive. By 1943, watching those pilots deploy to the Pacific and return with stories of successful missions, he understood the training system worked. By 1944, reading casualty lists that were long but sustainable, he understood that America could afford losses Japan couldn't. By 1945, watching atomic mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki on newsreels, he understood that the war's final character bore no resemblance to the battle he'd fought. He'd released a 500-pound bomb from 2,500 feet and hit a specific spot on a specific ship with accuracy that required skill and training and courage. The B-29 cruise over Hiroshima released a single bomb from 30,000 feet and destroyed an entire city with a weapon that required industrial capacity beyond anything 19th century war theory had contemplated. Both actions ended enemy resistance, one through precision, one through overwhelming force. Both were warfare. The distance between them represented 3 years of technological acceleration, driven by military necessity and unlimited budgets, and the kind of scientific mobilization that only total war could justify. Kleist never spoke publicly about whether the atomic bombs were justified. That wasn't his place. He'd been a lieutenant junior grade in 1942, flying missions he was ordered to fly, bombing targets he was directed to bomb. Strategic questions belonged to admirals and presidents and historians who had perspective he'd never possess. His job had been simpler: point the Dauntless at the target, release at 2,500 feet, pull out without dying, repeat until the war ended or his luck ran out. He'd done that job competently. 3 direct hits in one battle, survival when most of his squadron died. That was his contribution. Let others debate the larger meanings. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and memories did, he'd think about the faces he'd seen on Kaga's deck in the seconds before release. Japanese sailors pointing upward. Some running, some frozen, all of them understanding that death was falling toward them from an angle they couldn't defend against. Were they thinking about duty, family, survival? Or had thoughts stopped entirely, replaced by the animal instinct to flee that evolution had wired into humans long before aircraft existed? He'd never know. The bomb had erased those men before he'd pulled out of his dive. Their last moments remained private, known only to themselves, and whatever happened after death, if anything did. That uncertainty characterized the whole war for him. You flew missions that killed men you never spoke to, destroyed ships you'd never see repaired, contributed to strategic outcomes you couldn't predict. And then you went home and married Jean and had children, and built a career in aircraft design and lived a normal life as though the 6 minutes over the WWII hadn't happened. Except they had happened. The Navy Cross in his drawer confirmed it. The squadron photographs with empty spaces confirmed it. The nightmares confirmed it. The memories that wouldn't fade even after 70 years confirmed it. The last verification came in 2016, 5 months after Kleist died. A research vessel located Kaga's wreck on the ocean floor, 17,000 feet below the surface, broken but identifiable. Cameras captured the collapsed flight deck, the broken hull, the debris field spreading across the seabed. The hole where his bomb had struck was still visible, a puncture in steel that had held for 74 years before corrosion began erasing it. That hole represented the exact point where his training intersected with history. 3 seconds earlier or later, and the bomb would have missed. 10 degrees difference in dive angle, and the impact point would have shifted. But he'd done everything correctly, and the bomb had hit exactly where he'd aimed, and Kaga had died because one pilot out of 32 had put his ordnance precisely where physics and training and courage directed it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen. Now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942, when Yorktown finally sank after fighting to stay afloat for 3 days. The strategic consequences continued for 3 more years. Japan never recovered offensive capability. America never stopped building. The mathematics of industrial war dominated everything that followed. By war's end, America would have over 100 aircraft carriers of various sizes. Japan would have handfuls. The disparity wasn't about courage or skill or tactical innovation. It was about steel production and oil reserves, and training infrastructure, and code breaking, and all the unglamorous logistics that determined who could sustain pressure and who cracked under it. Norman Kleiss understood this eventually. Not in 1942 when the battle was fresh. Not in 1962 when he retired from the Navy as a captain. But in 2016, at the end of a 100-year life, looking back across decades of peace that his 6 minutes of war had helped purchase. The torpedo crews had bought his survival. His bombing accuracy had contributed to Japan's defeat. That defeat had enabled the peace. The peace had allowed him 70 years with Jean, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a life that would have been impossible if the bombs had missed, or the torpedo crews hadn't drawn the Zeros down, or McCluskey hadn't followed the Arashi's wake, or any of 1,000 variables had broken differently. He never called himself a hero because heroes in his definition were men who didn't come back. He'd just been lucky enough to execute training perfectly at the exact moment when perfection mattered most. The convergence of skill and timing and desperate necessity that characterized Midway more than any battle before or since. 6 minutes when everything aligned. 6 minutes that changed the Pacific War. 6 minutes that proved democracy could build weapons systems, train operators, and deploy force with precision that totalitarian efficiency couldn't match. 6 minutes that cost 3,000 Japanese lives and 147 American lives, and established the trajectory that would end in Tokyo Bay 3 years later, with surrender documents signed on a battleship named Missouri. That was the true power the Japanese carriers discovered that morning. Not bombs from altitude, not tactical innovation, but systematic competence applied at industrial scale by a nation that had finally decided to fight. They'd thought Americans were soft, isolated, unprepared. They discovered Americans were methodical, adaptable, and impossibly determined once committed. The mistake was assuming Pearl Harbor would break American will. Instead, it focused American industrial might on a single purpose. By June 4, 1942, that purpose had learned how to fly Douglas SBD Dauntlesses from 20,000 feet into vertical dives that ended with 500-pound bombs, striking carrier flight decks covered with exposed ordnance. The carriers thought they were safe. They were wrong. And 6 minutes of dive bombers proved it in ways Japan's Navy would never recover from. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.